What if the place meant to save lives was haunted by those who never left? Hospitals are filled with tragedy, pain, and death, emotions so strong they sometimes leave an imprint that refuses to fade. Doctors, nurses, and staff members working the night shift have encountered things beyond explanation. Whispers in empty hallways, figures standing in the dark, and chilling encounters that defy logic. These are their terrifying true stories. If you think hospitals are scary during the day, wait until you hear what happens at night. Story 1. The Screaming Room. I used to work the night shift at a now-abandoned psychiatric hospital. It was an old facility, built in the 1920s, and it had seen its fair share of horrors. The place had a reputation. Patients talked about hearing whispers, doors slamming on their own, and seeing shadows where no one should be. But nothing prepared me for what I experienced in the West Wing. There was a room, room 502, that was always locked. Always. No patients were housed there, and no one spoke about it. But every night, around 2:30 a.m., we would hear screaming coming from that room. Blood-curdling, agonizing screams. It would go on for minutes, and then silence. Security would check, but the room was always empty. One night I had enough. I asked an old nurse about it, and she paled. "They locked someone in there a long time ago," she whispered. "A patient who never stopped screaming, even after she died." That night I stood outside room 502 at 2:30 a.m. The screaming started, echoing through the hall. My body froze, but I forced myself to look through the small window in the door, and I saw her, a woman with hollow eyes, her mouth twisted open in an endless scream. She turned her head slowly, locking eyes with me. The next thing I remember, I was on the floor, a nurse shaking me awake. The door was still locked, and the room was empty, but the screaming never stopped. Story 2. The shadow in the basement. Every hospital has a basement, a place where old records are kept, where outdated equipment gathers dust. At my hospital, the basement was strictly off-limits. The locks were rusted, the lights barely worked, and the air was thick with the smell of mold and something else, something rotten. One night, I was sent down there to retrieve a file. The moment I stepped inside, I felt it, a presence. The hairs on my arms stood up. My flashlight flickered, and for a split second I saw something move in the darkness. Then a whisper. "You shouldn't be here." I turned to run, but the door slammed shut behind me. I pounded on it, screaming for help, but no one came. My flashlight flickered again, and that's when I saw it. A shadow darker than the darkness around it. It stood at the far end of the room, watching. Then it moved. The next thing I remember, I was outside the basement door, gasping for breath. No one could explain how I got out, but I'll never forget the feeling of something breathing down my neck, whispering as I fled. Story 3. The Patient Who Wasn't There. One of the eeriest experiences I ever had working in a hospital involved a patient who wasn't there. We had received a new admission, an elderly woman who had been found wandering the streets, confused and muttering about them. She had no family, no records, no identification. We placed her in a secure room, gave her a meal, and let her rest. The next morning she was gone. The room was locked from the inside, the bed still made. The security cameras showed no one entering or leaving. It was as if she had vanished, but at night we could hear her voice. "They're coming," she would whisper. "They're always watching." Then one night we found her, or at least her body, buried deep in the hospital's old records in a room that hadn't been opened in decades. She had been a patient in the 1960s. She had never left. Story 4. The Hands Under the Bed. Some patients see things that aren't there. Others see things that we wish weren't there. One patient, a young girl, was admitted after she stopped speaking altogether. Her parents claimed she refused to sleep in her bed, saying, "The hands will get me." We assumed it was childhood trauma. That was until one of the nurses saw them too. She was checking on the girl late one night when the child sat up suddenly, staring at the floor. "They're coming," she whispered. The nurse bent down to assure her everything was fine. That's when she saw the fingers, long, bony fingers curling out from underneath the bed, gripping the mattress. She screamed and yanked the girl away. Other staff ran in, turning on all the lights. There was nothing there, but the child never slept in a bed again. Hospitals hold more than just the suffering of the living. They hold the echoes of the past, the tortured souls that never left, and the darkness that lurks in the corners of forgotten rooms. If you ever find yourself alone in a hospital late at night, and you hear whispers, footsteps, or the sound of breathing when no one is there, leave. Because some doors should never be opened, and some patients never leave.